Chapter 29, Making the News. Well, all I know is what I read in the papers. That Japanese earthquake, in addition to being the greatest calamity in the history of the world, even at the time that it happened, has, according to newspapers and experts, not reaped half of its destruction yet. Every day something happens, and we don't know exactly just what it is, and it'll turn out in the morning paper to be the earthquake in Japan that caused it. We lost 7 self-destroyers on the rocks just above here the other day. People thought at first that it might have been a fog, but it wasn't. It was the earthquake in Japan. Will Rogers. Ideally, the silo would have been avoided. There were contingency plans, but ultimately the decision was reached that the quickest, nearest way out from the world of madness was the best, and they'd handle the fallout when it came. So Ed, Carl, Ricky, and Ethan put together half a dozen scenarios and planned as best they could, commissioning Amber to secure varying supplies for them in nearby Aberdeen. Even so, the final situation Ricky encountered at the silo was nothing any of them had prepared for. Perhaps, though, in a good way. Getting there was certainly an adventure. The RV they had purchased from Ed's cousin on the farm was a full rig. It was 30 feet long and quite obvious. That itself was an unexpected form of camouflage. It definitely appeared as though it were an older couple's accumulated retirement spendings. It was a late model RV from the mid-90s. The windows were tinted, and until the cats and soap tank, it had been impeccably clean. The back end of the RV opened up all the way like a huge mouth. It was a toy hauler, tracks for an ATV extended to the ground at the press of a button. This is how the large soap tank had been loaded. Empty, said tank was about 500 pounds, but it had wheels. Ricky was able to open the back of the RV, at length push it down out from the RV using the tracks, and leave it on a plain somewhere in the middle of South Dakota. He kept the kittens locked in the bathroom when he did this, and incidentally decided he might as well flush the black tank. He could see cattle in the distance. They would mess the field much more than the sewage from his black tank. Outside, occasional trips to siphon gas, steal soap, or acquire other supplies on the sly. Ricky and Ethan had spent the previous days entirely in the RV. It was stocked up, but human beings need the restroom on occasion, and they'd already filled that sewage receptacle. Ricky figured he might as well kill 2 birds with 1 stone. The wind was slight, and as Ricky stowed the hose of the black tank, he felt a chill go over him. Looking skyward, he wondered if rain were imminent. He continued to check the sky as he went about his work. It wasn't until he'd finished removing and flushing everything, lastly closing the back end of the RV, that one of the bulls noticed him. At first it stared, then its nostrils flared, then it let out a bovine war cry and began to run straight for him. Ricky heard the galloping sound of the animal's large hooves, and turned in time to see it suddenly burst through a wide grouping of digested plant matter and pungent muddy cow piles, kicking up a hurricane of flies. Ricky squinted, feeling his heart begin to beat as the bull continued full speed into and through a barbed wire fence only 50 feet away. The metal and its barbs did delay the brute briefly, maybe for a second or two. It hit them with such force the metal lines pulled up several wooden stakes driven into the ground, and flecks of blood were thrown quite a distance. This tripped up the bull, causing it to tumble, its back end coming over its front end, and its rabid face going straight into the dirt. Despite itself, the animal made a pained sound, but did not slow its momentum. It spasmed massive legs until they met the earth again, and as soon as it could stand, it once again continued coming for Ricky. Foam flecks misted from its nose and mouth like steam, and its eyes had the wildest, most insane character Ricky had ever seen on an animal. Shock briefly prevented him from realizing what he saw, but when it clicked, he swiftly withdrew his gun, aimed at the animal's head, and emptied the clip. Most of the bullets made contact, causing the beast to bellow, stagger, and crash into dirt right at the feet of Ricky, where it trembled and died in a pool of blood, limbs continuing to twitch. It was the first deranged animal Ricky had encountered since the bear, and it had certainly seen him. If the bull had seen him, they had seen him. Ricky stared at the dead animal a moment more, muttering, "Nani would call me the devil." Sorry, Gram, that one was definitely not holy. He looked at the sky again, then moved in a trot to the other side of the RV. He let the kittens out of the bathroom, they'd tear it up if he made them remain locked away while he drove, jumped behind the wheel, locked the doors with the button, and pulled off the dirt road he had used as a detour. I have got to find cover, he said. It was luck or providence that the day had become cloudy, or he would be visible to any eye in the sky that could watch him. Even so, the word had gone out. Every mile or so, an antelope or a deer or a cow or a goat or a sheep or something went kamikaze and came at his RV. Most hit the side of the vehicle rather than the front, owing to its speed and their organic limitations. The plight of these zombified creatures was quite hopeless, but they were having an effect. Ricky managed to keep from hitting the majority of them, though at one point a cow walked out into the middle of the road and got right in front of the RV. He slowed to a stop and it started ramming its head violently into the grill right before the driver's seat. Ricky drove forward slowly, shuffling the animal off to the side rather than running it over. Its built-in fight or flight reflexes kept it from remaining still long enough to become lasagna. The birds were actually the worst. They'd come out of nowhere and fly full speed into the wide flat window at the front of the vehicle. Now there were half a dozen impact points where crows, robins, kestrels, sparrows, and the occasional landlocked seagull had ejected themselves from life. There were surprisingly few pigeons. Certainly these things did not sit well with Ricky. Before the present events, many at the Bureau had thought him stoic. Often he was just trying to understand. In this scenario, his stoicism was rooted in utter confusion. The sudden change in situation had him panicked for the better part of an hour until he managed to think his way through it properly. He was about 100 miles from a change in time zones and about 400 miles from the point he had circled on the map. Ricky was headed northeast across South Dakota toward North Dakota, where was the silo that would be the exit point of Ethan, Carl, their women, and hopefully Ed. The silo was at particular coordinates between Dickinson and Fargo, which admittedly was an almost totally empty grouping of rolling plains save Bismarck. American tundra like the Siberian steppe. This was really the majority of the state, and Ricky had yet to cross the border into that flat open land of nothing. What he finally realized he needed to do was confuse his pursuers. It was an hour from nightfall, and the rain had begun. It would be full dark soon. The satellites couldn't see through clouds, the animals couldn't distinguish between some semi and an RV driving down the road from a distance in the dark. So that would likewise hamper the demons that sought to possess him. Ricky doglegged south and began driving in circles until full darkness, then found a 2-lane highway on the Atlas and traveled straight north, only stopping to fuel up when he was well inside an Indian reservation. He paid in cash for gas at the kiosk of a convenience store that had not been updated since the 70s. The teenager behind the counter kept pointing to the middle of his forehead and saying, "Dot, not further," then pointing at Ricky and laughing. There should have been surveillance at that old gas station, but the Cheyenne Reservation in the northern center of South Dakota was not a reservation that had kept with the times. The kid behind the counter said it was better than the reservation south of Rapid City, but that wasn't saying much either. He then made a number of auntie jokes with the veneer of yo mama jokes. They were more sexually oriented and disturbing, though. Ricky laughed non-committedly at one of them, then thought up something that might make the cashier smile and said, "How!" on his way out of the door, holding his right hand up and bobbing his head like a true Punjabi. How! Indeed, the teenager behind the counter thought that was about the funniest thing he'd ever seen. Ricky continued driving through the night, only stopping when he found an RV storage lot on the outskirts of a community called Jamestown. There, Ricky closed the accordion privacy partition between the cab and the back of the RV, killed all the lights, opened the top vent only slightly, and slept in one of the bunks near the bathroom in the back. Someone did come knocking about 4 in the afternoon, having noticed a random RV trying to blend in with the rest and likely taking up a spot someone else had paid for. Ricky ignored the knocking and waited until whoever was responsible walked away. They'd call Ed's cousin in South Dakota after running the plates. Towing would be too expensive for a big rig like that anyway. At minimum, such an undertaking would require finding the one guy in town who could handle it. That might just take a few days in a community as small as Jamestown. As soon as it was dark again, Ricky crept out, did a walk around to make sure nobody had put any boots on the tires. They hadn't. It wasn't the big city. Then jumped back in the driver's seat and cruised right through the closed front gate of the lot. It barely even scratched up his grill. The birds had made much more of an impact owing to the glass spider webs they left on the massive windshield. He only had another 80 miles or so to go, and then he was at the coordinates, or rather just south of them. He stopped the RV by the side of the empty road in the middle of nowhere, North Dakota, at 3 in the morning. Ricky turned on the hazards, jumped out, and jogged down the dirt path to see what he could see. There hadn't been any military infrastructure the whole way, but now he saw where there once was a guard shack on the premises. By the time Ricky came to it, he realized the structure was essentially a ruin. Ricky jogged back to the RV and drove it into the road past the remains of the shack. It was only dirt until the RV came over a rise, then it became wide, paved, and unkempt as he coasted down the other side. When he finally made it to the silo, it was entirely bereft of any sign of life. The front entry was essentially a circular door surrounded by cement with occasional weeds shooting up through cracks. It had been about 3 days, all told, from the time Ricky left Carl and Ethan at Devil's Tower. The trek should have been a day's drive, but the RV had a short range that required frequent refills. Went slow, and Ricky had to be as careful as he could. If not for mad bulls, then for equally crazy shills of the demon interlopers. At the end of it all, he was definitely feeling tired. The cats were getting used to him, and that was actually something he'd never admit to the other guys. He quite liked cats. Also, since he was their meal ticket, they were inclined to be friendly. Ricky took care of their food and water needs, cleaned the box hidden in the back near where the soap tank had been, doused the lights, and got some more sleep. When he ventured out the following day, what he saw was certainly not what he expected. There were 4 or 5 large wind turbines that were unique. He had been unable to discern them in the darkness of the previous evening. They were about 50 feet high and spun much more quickly than those he'd seen acting as horizon eyesores all across the Dakotas. There was also a plot of land around 3,000 or 4,000 square feet in size that was covered in solar panels. The panels themselves were under some sort of transparent protective barrier, and robotics within that barrier cleaned it, while other robotics would periodically dust off the panels, and some third system would suck out the detritus and little puffs of dust that farted out from the transparency every couple hours. The turbines and solar represented off-grid energy redundancy. They continuously filled batteries, and should one fail, the other would step in. If Ricky had to guess, he figured the third redundant power supply would likely be petroleum-based and run from a reservoir within the silo. In the center of the land, where the silo was, a large circular door made almost entirely out of concrete remained closed and impenetrable. The only other thing besides grass, dust, and scrub brush in the area was a flimsy sign that had been hammered into the hard ground. It was a sign to a real estate agency called New Millennium Homes. Behind the sign was a little metal box. When Ricky opened it, he found a few dozen brochures, and the brochures explained the silo in detail. It had been remodeled as an end-of-days apocalypse bunker. Nobody planned for this. And at first, Ricky was quite elated. He'd expected the installation was just one of the many that had become dead in the wake of the Cold War. He had feared the military might have reawakened it owing to the new tensions in Ukraine. He couldn't have imagined some private developer had purchased the silo and revamped it so a billionaire could have a readout after humanity blew itself up. You'd about have to be a billionaire, too, for that sort of readout. The brochure advertised a $70 million price tag. Said brochure went on to advertise the converted silo now had 15 floors, stretching almost 200 feet underground. Apparently, the subterranean structure could keep 75 people hale and healthy off-grid for up to 5 years without any need to replenish supplies. In the middle of the brochure, a booklet really, was a diagram of the silo, which was 50 feet wide and had a detached control center that was somewhere else underground, connected by a short corridor. According to the booklet, this was now a hydroponics facility that also had some sort of water collection and treatment infrastructure. It was additionally where dry goods were stored. The idea was underground horticulture. In the silo itself, each floor had a different purpose. There was a pool, a movie theater, a dining area, a socialization area, and a residential area that was set up like a number of small apartments. The brochure advertised the silo was 54,000 square feet, or about 3,600 square feet per floor. There was a wastewater treatment and disposal facility at the very bottom that the brochure indicated drained to a leach field from which purified water was reclaimed, repurified, and pumped to the top where gravity plumbing distributed it throughout the rest of the facility. There was also a foyer at the top of the underground building acting as an entryway and given extensive exposition throughout the booklet. It looked like the waiting room of a dentist's office. In the center of the converted silo was an elevator surrounded by a stair. The elevator was 5 feet by 5 feet according to the booklet, and the spiral stair wrapped around it. Ricky was reminded of the cylinders from the other world. Basically, where the missile should have been in the silo, the remodeling developer had installed a sort of elevator atrium. The brochure spent a whole section boasting how the elevator spun clockwise as it ascended, opening at different places on each floor to give residents variety. The whole thing had wraparound windows, and the paint scheme was designed to evoke organic vistas of healthy nature. There were lots of greens and browns. "It's a condo," Ricky said, and looked up from the booklet, pocketing it a moment later and walking forward to the great concrete door acting as entry to the space. There was just the one door. He tried to figure out how it could be opened for a half hour before referring to the booklet again, where a paragraph explained that except for a particular electronic key owned by the realty office, the only way to open the door was from the inside. This was advertised as a feature. Ricky looked around at the empty nothingness of North Dakota. The animals, under the spell of the wicked ones, had not found him yet, though he saw a few prairie dogs in the distance and was suspicious one might become an antagonist if he weren't careful. What it very much looked like was that he would simply have to wait until somebody came out of that silo. If it took them an hour to retrieve the women in the other world, that would be a full month. Ricky sighed expressively. He'd likely be stuck out here in the middle of nowhere a few weeks at least. He just hoped no showings were scheduled by the real estate company in that time. It was total darkness. Carl's first move was to find a hard surface against which he carefully leaned Genevieve, pulling out a flashlight. Now the only illumination came from the portal itself and seemed to show, well, a pretty basic apartment, weirdly enough. Scratch that. It was a luxury apartment. "Oh, sure, Slinky," Carl replied, looking back at the portal. The man who he thought was an Ake agent named Farley was helping carry the woman Ethan meant to save named Chloe, who was really Claire. But Farley was really Fogarty, Blake instead of Jake, and he was Ed's son. Ed was helping him carry the girl. Carl watched as they came forward in slow motion, not quite convinced. Ethan was gradually turning to look behind at the entry of the sphere, and Carl could see the orientation of the space shifting, if slowly. Then he saw Jake Blake kick the wall-eyed cat into the portal. The kitten was airborne a solid 3 seconds, long enough for Slinky to hiss. Then it came through and squealed in pain. Carl caught it and comforted it, as did Slinky, who ran up to him. Then Carl saw the foot of Blake coming through and put the kitten down, bringing the flashlight he had withdrawn from his pack up. It happened to be the one attached to the .45. Jake stepped through with Clever Ed, and the portal immediately closed. Carl heard the kitten make retching sounds behind. Now the only light came from his weapon, and he had it aimed right at Farley's face. "Ed, he has backstabbing plan." "Well, keep a gun on him then," Ed said, followed by, "While you're at it, point that thing at me so I can find a place to lay this broad down. Blake, eyes on me. Let's get her settled." Farley appeared as though he had been about to do something else, but he followed Ed's lead, and they carefully put Chloe down next to Genevieve on the floor, then stood up. Ed was wiping his hands off as he turned back to Carl. "Now, what do we do?" "Farley, man." Carl was still keeping the gun trained on him, staying a little beyond arm's reach in the dark, making him doubly dangerous. "You say you are on our side, okay, but maybe you see it is hard to trust you right away, yes?" Farley looked at the ground, then he smiled, scratched a patch of skull where his hair had been over a year before, but only a day or so in Farley's recollection, then looked up and said, I understand, fella. We messed up your house. Came out of nowhere. Wasn't personal, you know. It was the portal, that cat. Where is that cat? When he said this, Ed and Carl both looked, and incidentally they gave Farley his opportunity. He dove at Carl, overpowered him, stole the gun, and would have shot him, but Ed dived into his legs and knocked him into a surprisingly stout wall in the nick of time. The shot went wild, and the two men wrestled over the gun, but Farley managed to prevail. Something kept him from kicking his old man, maybe what ghost of a soul remained. He settled for knocking him out, and he managed to do the same for Carl. Farley had feigned greater weakness than he felt from the moment he awoke. He couldn't totally steel his mind against the onslaught of madness, and he had an anger against ACHE and those who were supposed to keep the pact and had not. His present ambitions were not fully fleshed out. He did know, however, that above all else it was imperative he retain control. The thought also struck him that both Ed and Carl had information he needed vitally. It would be best to get that information before they were liquidated. They were bound and would have a headache. They would live, they would awake. He put them next to the women, and likewise bound them. He had to run about the apartment finding materials to do this. In a closet near a door that looked like an entryway, he had found a number of extension cords. These did the trick nicely. Farley wasn't a total monster. He arrayed them all comfortably. Looking at the four, he mused to himself, I'd just get that Baba Yaga cat. He might let me run a whole outpost. And he began searching for Slinky. Slinky had hightailed it with Kitten Cletus and would not be seen any time soon. Both cats were within the innards of a couch presently and silent as the cotton making up its cushions. After a fruitless 5 minutes searching, Farley muttered, I gotta get more light in this place, and left his hostages where he bound them, hand and foot, in the dark. It would develop that the fuse box was at the basement of the facility. It would develop the door that looked as though it led to the outside of an apartment in reality gave on the inside of the silo where a stairway spiraled around that was connected by an elevator. Lastly, it would develop the wiring of the facility was located in the very basement, and Farley didn't immediately know that, so he spent the next hour and 15 minutes figuring out where he was and what he needed to do to get the lights on. First, he ran upstairs, where he found a few leisure facilities, a cafeteria, and a foyer to a concrete door that required the system to be active. All was dark, save for one light on a panel near the entry indicating external power, for what good that did him. It did confirm his suspicion that the actual electrical controls of the space were elsewhere. As he searched, he pulled out his phone, which had made it through his stint with the aliens, though his badge was nowhere to be found. Must have slipped out of his pocket. Also, the phone was totally dead. It would do him no good, and he actually pitched it. He knew the secret numbers anyway. Meanwhile, in the apartment, almost perfectly centered within the silo, a rip in space-time was preceded by a kitten pinwheeling its limbs in slow motion before rolling through the gap and landing with a hiss and a puke. Ethan came through just in time for the portal to close, leaving him in darkness. He had to search about his person carefully before he found a lighter, and it revealed Carl, Ed, Chloe, and Genevieve, unconscious and bound hand and foot on the floor of... Was this some kind of apartment? Wasn't it supposed to be a nuclear silo? Did they have barracks this chic in the military? Ethan didn't think about it too hard. He ran over to Carl and shook him awake. Carl said, then suddenly snapped awake and yelled, "Твою мать!" before spitting percussively. "Whoa, fam, it's me. Ethan, the Farley man. He's like you thought, of course." "Where is he now?" "I do not know. Oh, my head. It will feel like a hangover." Ed moaned, yet unconscious, but seeming to reciprocate. There was abruptly a deep rumbling sound, and a tiny red LED lit up somewhere in the room. It belonged to a smoke alarm. It was so dark this almost illuminated the space as it was directly above. Ethan got to the business of unbinding them. Carl helped as soon as he was free. Ed was still unconscious, but they got his arms and legs out and turned to the women. Ethan was just pulling the power cords off Chloe when he heard steps and a hand on a door handle, and his gun was not in arm's reach as he had set it down to unbind the captive. This was likely out of providence. Ethan had to basically just act. What he did was turn, run, and dive into a silhouette against a lit exterior. Farley had found the fuse box and returned to open the door and figure out his next move. That's why the LED on the fire alarm had activated. In no way did he expect Ethan to come at him full speed and knock him headfirst into a glass elevator shaft. Thankfully, said glass was bulletproof and could handle some abuse. It was hard enough that when his head made impact, it rendered him unconscious, and it would now be his turn to have a headache. The cats showed up from nowhere. Slinky had rendezvoused with Stumpy and Cletus. She sat and growled at Farley. The kittens mimicked her hilariously. A fourth kitten, yet unnamed, turned up shortly. It was Ed's. Apparently it had survived the flight, and Ed being bound hand and foot, only emerging at some feline prompting from Slinky. Carl and Ethan had been discussing what to do with Farley a good 5 minutes when Ed stumbled out, rubbing his head. "He's my son," he said. "Just get me back to Amber. I'll deal with him. Ricky's up top. For sure, by now." "It's not that easy," Carl replied. "If he is still with them, then what his eyes see, they see. The bear, Banff. Remember, the bear saw us. Then they showed up in ours." "Right," Ed muttered, rubbing his eyes. Then, "Okay, we blindfold him and throw a sack over his head." Carl exhaled. "Sure. All right, fam, now, how we get out of here?" "Elevator," Ed pointed. They took up Chloe, who was Claire, and Genevieve, made their way to the elevator, and headed for the top of the silo. They just had to push a button. Farley'd already done them a favor, almost. "When they gonna wake up, Carl?" Ethan struggled to keep Chloe Claire from falling. "I do not know. I did not know they could." "Right," said Ethan. "Malkuth said they'd be brain dead if you just woke them up." "It is different for the girls, maybe," Carl offered. "Blake made it through," contributed Ed, indicating unconscious Farley on the elevator floor. The lift came to the top of the bunker silo. They offloaded everybody, cats included, then left them resting on foyer couches. It took another 20 minutes to figure out how the concrete blast doors that made up the exit worked. As it turned out, a platform lowered down from the very top, developing handrails as it did, and coming to rest atop the elevator's cylindrical shaft. The stairs spiraled up to this platform. "Seems a bit impractical," Ed muttered, rubbing his head. Abruptly, the silhouette of Ricky appeared against the deep blue sky. "Finally! 15 entire days I have been here, sir." "I was just gonna call you," Ed yelled back up, showing him one of the burner phones. "No use. Coverage is nothing," Ricky called back. It took another 10 minutes to get everybody up and out of the silo. They loaded Genevieve on the couch in the center of the RV and put Chloe, who Ethan stayed by very closely, on one of the back bunks. Farley they put on a bunk in a tiny little side bedroom that was probably meant to be the master. They blindfolded him and tied him down so his hands and legs could barely move, making sure to close the drapes on the window. The cats got fed, everybody checked their resources, and Carl said, "We pray now for Genevieve, for Claire, for your son, Ed, to get through this final moment." And this they did. The drive to Aberdeen was about 8 hours. It should have been less than 3, but they took only back roads and never went faster than 40. They were a mile from the farm, and evening was coming soon, when Amber ran out of nowhere into the middle of the dirt path 1 hill off from the property. Ricky had to dynamite the brakes. She was covered in mud and had evidently come a long way. "What the hell, Amber!" Ed had been jostled halfway across the living room of the vehicle when Ricky hit the brakes, barely managing to catch himself on the pull-down bar of the cab bunk. Another barely managing to catch himself on the pull-down bar of the cab bunk. Amber ran to the side door and Ed opened it. What? We're almost back. How'd you know? I was watching the Goat Junction, Ed. It's a hidden angle. I saw you coming, nobody else did. Please, there's no time. I didn't believe you before. I'm so sorry. She was all tears. Before you came, I told your cousin, and he set up cameras, Ed. So they were watching you the whole time. What are you talking about? I'm so sorry I didn't believe you, and then I saw the cat come through the wall, and then it was too late. Cameras? What cameras? All through the house, Ed. They saw it all, they got it all. Steve Gates. He's back there right now. No cap, Steve Gates? Ethan's eyes lit up, then darkened when he remembered what he now knew about Steve Gates. Carl barked, Ricky, let me drive. We go now. And he half pulled the young man from the driver's seat as Ricky got the message and began to move. What do you mean they saw everything, Amber? Sit down. Amber leaned her head into Ed's shoulder where they were at in the living room of the RV. There's a camera in the foyer of my house and one in each of the bedrooms. I didn't know you'd have the cats. And I let you work where there wasn't any cameras, but they saw you come, they saw you go. They heard a lot of what you were saying. They saw you practicing with the cats, and they figured they'd just let us go about our business, stop us if they could, and if they couldn't, round us up at home base, Ed finished. I'm so sorry, Ed. I got a family full of... What's with me? Why I gotta get stabbed in the back all the time? Oh, Ed, stop. Listen, it's okay. You're not gonna believe it. I've just got to show you. And he took her by the hand to the bedroom where they had Farley tied up. Ed showed her the scar on his foot, and she gasped. Farley, meanwhile, issued a series of curses from under the sack over his head. He had begun to come around. Ed pulled said sack back to show her, but didn't remove the blindfold. Then he put the sack back down. Farley was bound hand and foot to the bed and couldn't do much about it. It's Blake, babe. He ain't dead. He's also not right in the head right now, and if he sees us, or you, or anything, they see it. He can hear us. It's not as good to him. Amber was speechless and sat heavily on a seat that folded out from the wall of the tiny room. Ed said, stay here a while. Talk to him. Don't reveal anything, but, well, you might could help him break out of it, you know. Pray. I gotta help us figure out what to do next. And he joined the others at the front of the RV. Ricky was in the passenger seat. Ethan was leaning in as Carl took them south toward a dirt access road that was increasingly bumpy. Carl glanced back briefly, then returned to the road. We cannot outrun them. They already know the make and model. We have a full load. He indicated backward with his head. Ed took his glasses off, cleaned them, put them back on, made brief eye contact all around, then said, everybody locked and loaded? Steve Gates had a thumb drive in his front pocket, and he kept feeling it with his fingers. He would catch himself, pull his hand back, and clasp it together with his other over his lap, taking care not to rock so much as he might have when he was younger. Nordic Jack sat beside him. They were in Amber's living room, and there was very little conversation. They had arrived that morning when eyes in the sky indicated the RV was leaving its previous coordinates in North Dakota. These coordinates had only been isolated a few days before. The data from the Divorcée was pictorial. It was able to reveal some tactics the miscreants planned to employ, but unfortunately she hadn't been able to provide them much more than that. Steve Gates, however, had isolated an IP signal operating through a VPN and traced it to Ethan's little laptop. He had downloaded all the information from it and pulled up the digital ladder behind him. Now the information only existed on his person. The information was infinitely valuable. They had sent Farley and Chloe after the possibility of a single portal. Here was evidence for thousands, perhaps infinitely more. The approximate coordinates of an infinity of portals, and the exact coordinates of dozens, maybe hundreds. So Steve Gates had leverage. Leverage kept him sane, but it couldn't totally bind his mouth. You really couldn't stop them in that place where you all go to.
Pleiadians aid them,
Jack replied stonily. Must not be a family thing, Steve observed, glancing at Jimbo, the landowner and cousin of Ed, who was drugged and handcuffed in a puddle of unconscious evacuations on a couch. There was a crackling sound. Beyond unconscious Jimbo, Jack and Steve were a SWAT team, or what was essentially a SWAT team, though it was composed entirely of ache grinners. The crackling sound was radio, and distant words echoed in an ear of the clear-eyed team leader. Nordic Jack's eyes narrowed. The clear-eyed team leader turned to Steve Gates, who was ostensibly in control over Nordic Jack, though the reverse was actually the case. The man said, "Sir, Amber Fogarty just came out of the bushes at an intersection a mile north-northwest, jumped in the vehicle, and they've changed course." Steve began to sweat. "Well, get after them! Scramble! Go!" "All units pursue," the man said into his headset. Steve immediately turned to Nordic Jack. "It's a foregone conclusion. Now hold on. I got you here. They're here. You've got them in the palm of your hand."
"If your organization weren't seeking to break the pact through forbidden entry, none of this would have transpired."
"Well, it wasn't strictly forbidden, was it? I mean, there was nothing that said if we found a fissure in time and space all on our own."
"You are of no further use to me."
There was a sound like a distant bell, and time seemed to stutter for an instant. The clear-eyed man didn't know what happened, but the grinners he had just dispatched felt it as surely as Nordic Jack. The mental essence of Steve Gates had just been absorbed into the collective. He was now fully marionette. When his body fell, as his mind had been essentially turned off by Nordic Jack, it hit the wooden floor like a sack of potatoes. His head impacted as well, though not enough to cause any serious injury. In his right hand was a piece of electronic flotsam that danced across the wood, eventually coming to rest under a set of rustic drawers by a table, the thumb drive with the portal coordinates. Thus, Nordic Jack did not see. He was too busy being relieved as though a weight had been lifted. Now Gates would do his bid and not produce atonal static in the midst of harmonious operations. Nordic Jack walked slowly forward toward the front door of the farmhouse, changing subtly and totally as he did so, becoming his true form, his trans-dimensional form, then reaching out and climbing into the mental spiral of the collective, seeking out the mind of Jake Farley. The ache team leader, who had until then thought Steve Gates was leading the operation, would stand with his mouth open in stunned confusion for several minutes. Ricky ran to the toy hauler section of the RV and stared out a window in the back. Two black SUVs with flashing lights had just appeared in the distance, but they were coming fast. "We got two!" he yelled to the front. "Make the shots count!" Ed yelled back. They hit a bump, and abruptly there was a screeching howl that shook the entire vehicle with its depth. Amber screamed and backed out of the little room. "Ed, help!" Ed ran back and looked in on his son, who had become suspended by the sheer magnitude of his effort, clothes ripping, lungs screaming, and body writhing. He was trying to break out of the restraints and making unwelcome noises that sounded like they were of another language, one that used evil like letters. "It's a horror movie," Ed quipped, then hustled Amber back from the door and closed it abruptly, turning to her. "Don't go in there again unless we get out of this. It's like a hive mind he's plugged into. Get down onto the fold-out bed there." A percussive bang indicated Ricky taking a shot out the back. "There's gonna be gunfire," Ed finished, then ran back and joined Ricky. They had more secure footing to line up shots than the grinners leaning out the windows of the SUVs pursuing behind, but a few bullet holes sprouted across the back of the RV anyway. Up front, Ethan said, "Carl, there's no way we beat them in this old thing. They got satellites, they got faster cars, bigger guns, the whole internet, fam." "Yes, this I know. What do? We just have to hold them off." Until what? Get blam! A round exploded the passenger side mirror. Get your laptop. Bring up nearby portal spots. At an intersection, one of the SUVs pulled in front of Carl and hit the brakes. He swerved to the side, but couldn't fully miss it, plowing into it hard and knocking it from the road. Looking behind at the wreckage he left in the remaining mirror before turning his eyes back to the road and hitting the gas. For his part, Ethan managed to focus on pulling up the grid of portals he had managed to put together. After a second more, he said, 4 points. Is there one under an overpass? I remember there being one under an overpass. Yeah, 6 miles. Ethan showed him on the map. Carl glanced at it quick. That will work. I remember where it goes. I have used it. Hold them off 6 miles and bring me Cletus. The news anchor had a trendy haircut and a voice that sounded as though it came from an assembly line. Here's one for the conspiracy theorists, Bob, she said, smiling and looking ahead like a shark. Just after 5 this afternoon on the 210, federal agents chasing a suspected MS-13 gang who had operated for years from an undisclosed location in North Dakota encountered a glitch in the matrix, as the kids are saying today. After a 20-minute chase south of Aberdeen, our helicopters caught this dramatic footage. Apparently armed, the assailants managed to damage several government vehicles. Here, a close-up of Ricky bore testimony to the local news crew's rationale for the MS-13 designation. Ostensibly, Ricky did look quite intense as he fired from the back of the RV. One of the SUVs in pursuit swerved and rolled, the other narrowly avoiding it as the RV turned a corner. Here's where it gets weird, Bob, the anchor continued. Our thoughts and prayers go out to the families of those brave policemen, Jan, the man replied. Yes, we do want to extend our thoughts and prayers, but, and this has people scratching their heads across the country right now. Look at this. And the camera panned around to the other side of an overpass. The RV was gone. The footage was taken right at the cusp of night, at the very tail end of the gloaming, as it were, so the light played tricks with the images which had been captured. Can we see that again, Jan? Bob looked intently at the teleprompter with the line. Let's roll it back one more time, Jan replied. It showed the image again. The RV could clearly be seen going under the overpass. And then as the helicopter panned around, it was just gone. Maybe 5 seconds had elapsed. Dozens of government vehicles closed in on the scene from multiple directions. One was on fire under the overpass and looked as though it had been damaged by something. The feed cut back to the news anchors. So is it a prank? You think it's a hologram, Bob? Or maybe something to do with the sunset? Jan made a sound that was supposed to be laughing, but definitely was not. I guess we know how Walter White got away all those times, Bob replied, again with the fake laughs, but in stereo this time. What happened was this. Ed yelled from the back. How much longer? They're going to get ahead of us! Farley continued to scream and writhe in the bedroom where he was bound. Chloe and Genevieve continued to sleep, and Amber cowered flat under the fold-out bed, flinching at every report of a firearm. Carl yelled back, I make a turn, you knock them out! There is place, crazy place! I have idea! As they were making the turn, Ricky managed to take out one of the SUVs, helped in no small part by Ed, and even Ethan taking a few shots from the window of the side door. Carl brought them quickly under the overpass, brought the RV to a complete stop when it was totally in shadow, and gave Cletus a bit of jerky. A portal the size of 3 RVs opened up across the road, giving on a flat bit of green meadow with a great gold and purple tree in the background. I was going to say kick out the glass, but never mind, Carl said, and dynamited the gas. Whoa, was all Ethan could say. Carl yelled, Make the cat puke, Ethan! Ethan began to shake Cletus, then put him down. The cat puked, and the portal iris closed behind in time for the front half of a squad car to get sliced in two, tumbling into the world between worlds. Do not worry, we will just be here shortly. I know a place. Bring that little weirdo to me, Carl indicated Cletus. Ethan obliged and handed the kitten, purring now, to Carl. Then he cleaned the vomit the animal had left on the wide dashboard. Ed ran up suddenly. "You out of your mind? They'll find us in a second with Farley. With Blake. He's still alive in the hive." "Do not worry. Here," said Carl, and stopped the RV, compelling the little wall-eyed black kitten. A portal opened into Redwoods. It was a bit smaller than the last one, but still large enough for the RV minus one mirror to scoot through. Once they had come into the portal and puked the cat, Carl put the RV in park and exited from the driver's door. It was a wide clearing, and it was surrounded by a few hundred large, but not massive, redwoods. They were just big enough to be distinguishable from traditional conifers. "Welcome," Carl said, "to the Red Black Hills."